really any of the other mid-developed countries out there, and by some measures, they're already ahead of the Canadians. So it's the perfect partner. We still have to build out the industrial plant. And there will be hiccups. Semiconductors is one where I'm a little worried. Assuming we solve the neon problem, I think the Biden administration is on the wrong track with semiconductors, because we do the high-end stuff. We do the stuff that's in your cell phone or that's in a server farm. So one of the fun things about fabs is it's all done under one roof because it's all clean room work, so it has to be. We only produce about 12% by volume, but we produce about 60% by value. So if it's a chip you're going to use in a spaceship or a high-end cell phone or a server farm, it's probably made in the United States already. The high-end fab facilities that the Biden administration is chasing, these are things that are produced in places like Japan and Taiwan and Korea, allies. I'm not saying I'm disappointed that it might be coming back, but I'm like, that's not where the weakness is. The problems are further down the quality scale. If you're talking Internet of Things, that's probably China. If you're talking automotive, that's probably Malaysia. That's where the holes are going to be in the future. So a degree of integration is still going to be required if we want all those things to continue, or we're going to have to find a way to allow American fabs to go down market. And that's not something you normally do unless the government is directly involved. Some of the companies, based on what the manufacturing subsector happened to be, started these moves 5 years ago. Others, like Apple, refused to admit there was a problem until May. And so they're only now starting to get their arms around the size of the problem. And 94% of their supply chain is within mainland China, so yikes. One of the reasons that we don't trust the government to do this is the government has not a particularly good track record. And that's not a criticism of our government, that's of all governments. When the government is going to start picking winners and losers, there's a cost to that. And that assumes that they get it right every single time. We're kind of in this transition period now where we would like the government to be more productive. It's unclear if they can. And where the corporate world has risen to the threat, but several years too late. And it's happening just as the baby boomers move into mass retirement, so we're doing it in an environment of a financial and a worker shortage. Well, as a Gen Xer, the boomers going away is not doomsday, but that's just me. Every inflationary trend of the post-war period is now coming back, and every disinflationary trend is turning on its head. So when we had our first big industrialization push in the 50s and 60s, it was all industrial driven. We now have to do that again with the manufacturing build-out. We have to double the size of the plant within 5 years. And then in the 60s to the 80s, we had the baby boomers come of age and buy houses and raise kids and all that consumer-driven inflation. Well, we've got the millennials going through the same process now. So we have to go through that process again. In the 80s and 90s, the Chinese joined the global economy, and so 1 billion workers pushed down the cost of manufactured goods. That's going away because the Chinese population is the fastest aging in history. And we also had an empire worth of Russian materials dumped on international markets in the 90s, keeping commodity prices under control for 30 years. And that's all now going away. So all 4 of these are happening at the same time. So 9 to 15% inflation for the next 5 years, I think is a good kind of starting point for the conversation. That assumes that we actually put our back into rebuilding and building out the industrial plant. If we fail to do that, we get almost as high of inflation, but 5 years from now, we haven't fixed the problem, and that just continues. For the last 25 years, Texas has been the American state that has grown the most robustly because, I don't want to say they've been anticipating this, but because a lot of the natural advantages of the United States, cheap land, cheap food, cheap electricity, exist there in spades, and they've got the partnership with Mexico just across the border. The Texas-Mexico axis has been globally competitive at the height of globalization in almost every sector. We now have the opportunity for the other 49 to join the party. And that's great. But every state is going to have their own policy. Every municipality is going to have their own policy, and not everyone's going to get it right. We're going to see both the strengths and the weaknesses of the federalized system now. Because the ones that get it right, hopefully the others can learn from it. But we're not all going to get it right on the first try. And places like South Carolina and Alabama and obviously Texas look really solid. But places like Florida and California are just kind of out in their own world right now. Manufactured products, the more complex they are, the more parts they have, the more varied a labor structure they require. So, for example, if you want to make a fax machine, the optic scanner is made by one group of workers. The plastic casing, which is injection molding, is made by a less skilled group. And then the wiring is done by somebody in the middle. 3 different groups minimum. The more diversified the system, the more important it is to have a partner in the wage structure, both in terms of quality of labor and cost of labor. And that's one of the reasons why the Texas-Mexico tango works so well. Texas has your high-tech workers in Austin, has your mass manufacturing in San Antonio, has your financial center in Dallas, and has your heavy industry and medium industry in Houston. So that is already 4 just in Texas. You go south of the border and you've got a similar makeup with all of the Mexican cities. And so the back and forth works great. This is one of the reasons why automotive does well in this zone. Automotive obviously is going to expand. Heavy machinery, heavy vehicles like ag equipment, construction equipment, that is going to kind of be a tag-along. But I'd really look very closely at electronics. Whether you're talking, not cell phones, but pretty much everything else that is not a computer and not a cell phone that runs on electricity that you use in your house, whether it's a blender or a smartwatch or whatever else, that is really well positioned. It will also employ 3 to 4 times as many people as automotive. And it all needs to come back, because right now almost that entire subsector is done in East Asia and it's China-centric. And that's not sustainable anymore. This is not something that has to be just Texas, but Mexico's got to be a part of the process no matter what. All of the border states can play. There's more than enough for everybody. But the one downside, labor. We're pretty close to tapped right now, and the Mexicans are not too far behind. So there's definitely a first come, first serve sort of environment in play here. Well, there's 2 big issues here. And remember, the hard legal work has already been done for all of this. Nafta 2 has been ratified and implemented by all sides. The U.S. already has a free trade deal with Colombia. So these are good things. The labor crunch in the U.S. and Mexico is becoming so acute that labor costs in Mexico have been rising. In part, this is because the Mexicans have moved up the value-added scale very impressively, but there's just a numbers issue. So Mexico is now in a position where it needs a lower wage, lower skill base. Mexico needs a Mexico, and Colombia is the most likely candidate. Second, like Mexico of 20, 30 years ago, Colombia is also a significant producer of a lot of the raw material inputs. So for first stage processing or lower value-added manufacturing, it was already a solid choice. And so we're going to be seeing North American NAFTA integration with the Colombian manufacturing space in a way that I think is going to be really impressive. There are obstacles along their way, there always are. They could use a lot of infrastructure improvement, for example. But I'm pretty bullish and pretty positive on the nature of that integration moving forward. Yeah, Americans luckily have diversified their taste when it comes to what integration means. It used to be that if you lived in Kentucky, your idea of export was going to Indianapolis. That's in the past now. Most American business people are pretty savvy, and while not everyone can merge with the Mexican system as effortlessly as the Texans can, there's a degree of understanding in the American space that this is necessary, and it's not going to just magically happen. We have to work at it. When you start breaking down the system, you get smaller pieces with less reach and fewer materials and less manufacturing in a smaller market, but that's not true for everyone. So I can see a world where the United States, after some admittedly hiccups, a few years from now, is now looking at shorter, simpler supply chains that are closer to home in what has become basically a captive market with the world's largest consumption base. That's pretty good. Parts of the world that can either do kind of a mini version of this, thinking here Argentina or France, or there are parts of the world who have basically approached the U.S. from a political point of view and a security point of view and says, yeah, okay, you're not going to support globalization anymore unless we pay you. Got it. What was that number again?